Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's Employer Briefing. These briefings are held twice a month on Monday and address COVID pandemic-related updates and other developments affecting our society, including the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as key judicial, legislative, and policy changes. This briefing will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future employer briefing. I would like to address some preliminary items before we begin. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's briefing will address the latest developments affecting employers operating during the COVID pandemic, the newest challenges employers are facing as part of the broad-based focus on discrimination in America, and key legal and federal agency developments. The presenters are FortneyScott attorneys David Fortney, Nita Beecher, and Bert Fishman. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our briefing.
Terrific. Thank you, Valerie, and greetings to everyone. Nita and Bert, great to see both of you, albeit on the screen. We all continue, as many on this call do, to work virtually from our home locations. But we have a lot to cover and look forward to spending the next hour with you to do that. So, Valerie, let's jump into the next slide, please. We have a couple of preliminary matters. First, just a word about us. I think, as most of you know, we are based in Washington, D.C., a law firm, and we represent clients on a variety of workplace matters. Particularly, we counsel employers on a wide range of issues involving the federal enforcement agencies, Congress, and the Washington-related issues. Indeed, those have been really at the heart of as we struggle to respond to both the COVID-19 challenge as well as the Black Lives Matter and the social changes. So these are issues that we're dealing with regularly, and as a result, much of our comments and discussion brings forward experiences that many of our clients are dealing with day in and day out. Next slide, please. Just a note to everyone that, of course, although the three of us are lawyers and many of you are our clients, which is wonderful, you should be sure to consult with experienced employment counsel to ensure that your specific question and how your facts apply and what the rules are that govern your specific situation are properly addressed. So with that, let's turn to the agenda so we can get started. As Valerie outlined, we have a number of things that over the last couple of weeks have really been occupying us and challenges for many of our clients. The question of schools, how they open, whether they open, what the impact is on the workplace has proved to be a very daunting challenge. Many people have said, why didn't we get this figured out earlier? We're sort of beyond that. We're still trying to figure it out now, and employers are still suffering and trying to figure it out along with everyone else. So we want to spend a little bit of time on those issues. Virginia is important because it issued guidance for reopening. That's important because it's the first jurisdiction, the first state to issue a mandatory standard. And we'll talk briefly on that so you understand that. And then, of course, our friends on the Hill, Congress is active or inactive. It's in a state of flux. So we're going to do our best to level set and make sure that you're up to date as Congress is, as we speak, reconvening and trying to address a number of deadlines, including the expiration of unemployment in less than a week. We're then going to shift and have an update on the Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly the recent push that we're seeing with many of our clients to hold corporations accountable. What I call you talk the talk, now let's see if you're walking the walk. Yeah. And that is exactly what's there. And finally, the federal agencies have continued to be busy little beavers, not just focused solely on COVID, but we want to make sure to capture that for you. So That's a lot for 60 minutes. We're going to do our best to plow through that. So let's jump right in and deal. We last spoke a couple weeks ago on the 13th, so let's move right into what's happened since then. Well, I think as we all know, the COVID situation continues to explode. This map is as of this morning, so it represents the national map. It represents that, again, we have a very large country, and so this challenge is not evenly distributed, as we've known for some time. We have those hot spots, and they are really hot, that you can see as indicated on the map. And for employers, many employers in those jurisdictions, as indicated on the map, have started to open, have been pulling back from opening, were planning to open, have invested monies in trying to get ready to open, are now pulling back. And in some cases, it's because the governors have indicated you need to pull back. Arizona's started to pull back a little bit. Other jurisdictions, not so much so. Florida and Georgia, the state government continues to be pretty wide open, but many employers, for obvious reasons, are beginning to have second thoughts, third thoughts. And it's not just the employers, but the individual employees. Let's not forget them. They are acutely concerned. And that's a point that we really want to talk a little bit about how that bears out. But this map, if you're a national employer, you look at that map, and boy, Montana looks great on that map, but and Maine. But otherwise, there are a lot of challenging jurisdictions there. Anyone, Nita or Bert,
David?
Anything you want to jump in? Yes, Nita.
I was just going to mention that what also has to be taken into account is that even with states where the numbers are not as large as, say, a Texas or a Florida, Missouri, for example, has had an increase every day for the last week, more cases increasing, and that's true of a lot of these states, which had not been particularly hard hit prior to this.
Right. So this map does not enable us to see that rapid escalation. It just is an overall summary. Well, let's look at the next slide, which helps us understand the trend. Again, this is a national number, and you can see that unfortunate line going sharply up with the new cases being reported. Note that it's sort of leveled off. Again, these are national numbers.
Yeah.
So if we would look and on the maps, you can look at individual states. Some of those states, particularly the red ones that we saw down there, Florida, Georgia, Missouri, as these new flashpoints come, their lines are almost vertical. I mean, they really are just escalating at a dizzying pace. And that is what is of such great concern. So I think this map, this is helpful, but it's so broad and such a generalized number, it does not necessarily tell the regional story or the state, or even within the state. There are certain components of the states.
David, this might
any comment?
Be a good place. Yeah, I was just going to mention, this is probably a good place to mention that this morning it was announced that 14 members of the Marlins baseball team, it was 12 players, I believe, and 2 coaches, have tested positive for COVID. That has caused a reaction of the Marlins are stuck in Philadelphia where they played last night. They decided to play after 4 players had tested positive, so they've also exposed the entire Phillies organization, everyone who was around them. And so now we have 2 games. I think they're going to be postponed. Right now they're not going to play. The Miami Marlins will not be playing tonight in their home opener, and the Phillies will not be playing the Yankees tonight, which they were planning to do. So this is a piece of what you're seeing right here.
Right.
And it'll be interesting to see where that goes just for baseball, for example.
Bert.
And let me also add, it doesn't just go to our national pastime. Our national security advisor, Mr. O'Brien,
Correct.
was reported today to have been infected with coronavirus. For him, obviously, trouble, but the national security advisor meets with the president numerous times every week. And it just raises another issue with respect to the spread of this pandemic.
One thing that strikes me is that even if you're not a Phillies or a Marlin fan, The question of these examples, the National Security Advisor and the two baseball teams now being infected, both of those are work environments that were pretty much, as they say, in a bubble with very heightened testing,
right,
very heightened isolation, yes, very heightened efforts being made. And yet, even with all those protective barriers, it's like a big gauze wrapper, we're still finding the challenge of COVID breaking through. This is why people, both employers and employees, are so concerned about the return to work as well as the return to school and some of the other issues we're going to cover. All right.
Correct.
Well, let's jump to the next slide, please, Mary. Schools. Let's talk about that. Let me just say before we jump into schools, if our attendees do have questions, I should have mentioned at the beginning, there is the chat box. I think everyone's familiar with that feature. Type them in. We'll pick them up in real time and do our best and be delighted to try to respond to those. But Bert, I'm going to ask you if you would lead, please, the discussion, at least kick off the discussion on schools.
Happy to do so. The schools remain the crucible where all of these multifaceted issues converge, whether it's parental concerns, whether it's employer concerns, whether it's health concerns. They all coalesce at the schools and what the schools are going to do. The new entrant this week was a CDC guidance on schools, which was interesting to say the least. It was a hybrid kind of document. The first part of it, which was kind of hortatory, urging people to consider going to reopen schools, the value of schools to young children, and downplaying the risks in many respects of infection, especially of the very young, kind of ignoring teenagers. And then it was discovered that the entire preface to the CDC guidance was written at HHS with minimum input from CDC. And once you got past the opening, you got back to the CDC guidance, which talked about cohorts of students, keeping them together in small groups, staggering school days to try to social distance, try to calm but notice the teacher's concerns, and then made a very strong point about please be cognizant of what's going on in your locality. And in response to that, so in some respects, the intro was a kind of political urging people to think about opening the schools, whereas the guidance was not unlike the original guidance from the White House on gatekeeping and gating and reopening. Part of this may be passé because a number of very large school districts throughout the country, Los Angeles, most of California for one, many of the southern tiers have already decided that because of various kinds of pressures, including health concerns, they're simply not ready to reopen. And one of the issues that we'll talk about in a minute is they haven't been given guidance from Washington, and they haven't been given funds to do the kind of social distancing and preparations that the teachers require and the many parents require. And that's what we've been mentioning this for weeks now. Everybody has more than one dog in the fight. The teachers are parents. The parents are teachers. The superintendents are parents. The politicians are parents. Everybody has many, many concerns about schools. And if we go to the next slide, we get to see some of the ramifications as how it impacts more than just schools, because we all know if you have to stay home to take care of your kids, you're not going to go to work. And that's why the schools is the crucible where everything comes together. If you're concerned about childcare, and childcare has now risen to the top even of congressional concerns, because everybody recognizes the school day in the best of circumstances, 4, 5, 6 hours a day. What do you do before and after if you have to go to work? So the teachers' unions, the staffs, many of whom are black and brown and are more highly affected by the virus, are showing reluctance. Schools are trying to respond, but again, the time pressures are simply enormous. Trying to get flexible schedules. Employers are joining in to try to find flexible and alternative schedules for parents who must take parts of their day to take care of kids either before, after, or during school, trying to give additional benefits to pay for all but non-existent child care. And we have to recognize that this is part of the cultural divide, and it's also part of the economic divide. If you're among those sets of workers that must go to work, that must earn a paycheck, cannot work from home, don't have a job such as this that can be done remotely, and it's not just white collar, blue collar, although that is an easy metaphor. It's part of the whole pay equity issue that we're all struggling with, and that's infecting other parts of this discussion that we'll be talking about. But the fact that they're starting to do this in July is one of the real problems, because many schools hope to open in August and they're just running out of time.
Yeah.
So some of what our clients have been struggling with, because obviously this is yet another strain on the budget, but providing additional flexible and alternative schedules. This is beyond the 12-week of expanded FMLA, because many workers have already blown through that 12-week period at this point.
Correct.
They did it in the spring and the summer. So there's not a reload on that. So this is not a federal mandate, but as a practical matter, in order to keep employees thinking through, okay, if you're going to have to take care of your child during the day, can you work during the evening? Can your spouse, is it a split shift? I mean, the scheduling, this is a whole new level that is troubling. The other thing is, should additional monies be paid to help facilitate either childcare or someone serving as a proctor for your child? That creates sort of, again, a two-tier system in the workplace. Those that have children that require that, those that don't. Many organizations are beginning to deal with this and say, well, look, we're going to try to put additional monies for those that need it. How do you define that benefit? Is it by dollars? Is it by hours? Not quite clear, but I think there is growing awareness within the employer community that the employer has to step up in many settings to bridge these differences. And whether it's through policy changes, flexibility, more money for paid benefits that can be used so that people can hire virtually or otherwise on-site people to work in pods or to help with children in schooling. This is a real challenge. The other challenge is those that cannot work from home, that effectively, if their child can't come, are they going to come to work? So employers that have workers that must come to work are beginning to look at creating highly sterilized, separated, compliant childcare facilities where otherwise they might not have been provided before. They didn't need to provide them. So these issues, this is big. This is a very significant issue.
One of the ramifications or implications of this, a crisis always focuses the mind, as it were, but the critical role of schools in our society has suddenly come to the fore. People have talked about 3 generations of underfunding education. Now it's being in a different context that, we don't have a national policy about school reopening. Governors are kind of overwhelmed with facing the disease. And now, once again, we're going to the private sector to try to lift some of these burdens without a template, and it is surpassingly challenging.
Well, let's get to the next slide while I'm saying this. Anita, I'm going to ask you to take that. But the private sector is realizing waiting for the government to come forward with a solution is not going to work. Companies need to grab the bull by the horns and design their own response. And part of the big challenge, Anita, is the employee pushback on reopening.
Well, for the obvious reasons. Employees were okay with coming back to work as long as things stayed the way they were in late May, early June. But now they're very uncomfortable, and we're starting to see, as you see, meat packers have been especially affected. I think we can all say this particular meat packers, their plant had 50% of the employees get COVID. And they're basically just asking the court to force OSHA to have their employer implement basic COVID requirements like masks and that kind of thing. You have Dish, the TV, like opposite of cable. They forced employees to come back to work. They had 2 employees die and 80 employees test positive. And it turns out they admitted in a virtual town hall with their employees, if they forced everybody back to work because they weren't performing, the company wasn't performing well enough, right, according to the executives. And so the opposite of what you all were just talking about, flexibility, is the lack of flexibility by management because they want to make their numbers because that's all that matters to them from a business perspective. And there were a number of articles, Wall Street Journal and a couple of other articles about employees being forced to go back to work. They mentioned specifically Phillips 66, for example, but others, where they told everybody they need to come back to work regardless, and they didn't enforce all of the OSHA requirements of masks and that kind of thing. Many of the executives didn't wear masks, for example. Then you've got McDonald's employees have been very creative. They've been suing over all kinds of things. They've sued over insufficient PPE. In Illinois, they sued over, they tried to use nuisance, the Illinois nuisance statute, public nuisance statute, to force the employer to provide them with additional protection. And there are a couple of other, there was a South Carolina newspaper that forced their employees back into the office, and they fairly quickly had an outbreak there. And just so you know, it's not just private employers, guys. A bunch of employees of the federal government, DOL, the federal grain inspectors, DOD, Homeland Security, are seeking hazard pay for coming back to work. The last thing I wanted to mention on this, and David, your thoughts would be, there was a bunch of confusion out of the new $600, well, about to end $600, I should say, unemployment, well, who it applied to and so forth. So the Department of Labor's, the ETA, Education and Training Organization, Employment and Training Administration, issued a letter to the states and said, because many of the states, to force people back to work, are saying, if there is a job, you need to take it. And the DOL said that in some circumstances, you can still get unemployment if you don't take the job, if you feel like it's unsafe. Now, it's much more, it's really up to the states. So again, it's going to be up to the states whether or not the job you're being asked to take is safe or not. And if it's not, if the state decides it's not, that it is safe, you're going to lose your unemployment if you don't take it, regardless of what you personally think.
Bert? You're on mute, I'm
Bert,
sorry.
We can't hear you.
I'll come back to you.
This is another example of the lack of a national policy forcing really individuals, not only governors, but individuals to make decisions about whether their workplace is sufficiently safe for them to go to work, and their implications that are just enormous, such as, can I pay the rent? And it's kind of chaotic.
This goes back, though, again, the litmus test is going to be whether the employer complied with the general duty clause. That is going to be the test on whether the workplace was reasonably safe or whether there was a well-found basis. And that is we've talked a lot about the general duty. It's not a regulation, but that's beginning to change a little bit. Let's jump to the next slide because I want to just highlight this example. In Virginia, normally we talk about federal trends, but we want to highlight Virginia. Why? It is the first state that has actually issued a specific standard, an emergency standard addressing COVID-19 in the workplace. This is exactly what many have advocated that federal OSHA should do. It's what the AFL-CIO sued the Labor Department to try to compel them to do. But unless it's within the discretion of the Secretary of Labor, and unless Secretary Scalia decides that that is the right approach for federal OSHA, it will not occur. However, the majority of states, recall there's federal OSHA and state OSHA, and a little more than half the states have what are called state plan states, which means that they set their own standards, just like they do minimum wage. It's at least as protective as the federal standard. Here you have Virginia. I don't know if we call it, I think it's a blue state still, but we have I'm a resident of Virginia. We have a Democratic governor, but it's purplish. But we have the state implementing, basically codifying what the general duty requirements are. And if you go down the tick list there, that is effectively what the general duty clause, the OSHA guidance, not a standard, but guidance, requires. And I think that these components, and the reason Virginia is important is for two reasons. One, other states may follow this lead, and a lot of them are looking at it. Two, this fits like a glove when you start talking about, are there going to be safe harbors? People say, well, what exactly are employers going to have to do? This answers the question. It tells the community this is what an employer has to do. If they would comply with that under the safe harbor argument, they get a safe harbor. If they engage in gross negligence and don't comply, no safe harbor. So Virginia is leading on this, and I think it's the beginning of what will be a trend pretty quickly. All right, let's go to the next slide real quick. Speaking of,
and I think the next slide,
efforts, yeah.
Well, the next slide really is about off work conduct, and we'll talk about this very briefly. But I think this is really important because we've talked before, and I think it's important to recognize that in the pandemic, your off work conduct is impacting whether you continue to be employed. We showed the Costco Ken last week. He got fired. A number of employers are saying if you leave the state for vacation, you have to quarantine yourself and so forth, depending on what state you're in. But I wanted to make one quick point about there's an NBA player for the Clippers who went to a funeral and then decided he had to go and have dinner at a gentleman's club. He's now quarantined and going to miss not only the preseason for the NBA because they're in a bubble, but also 2 games. And the Clippers are in the position, what if they end up losing and don't get to the finals, which people thought they could because of his behavior. So those are some of the things, and we're going to see, I think, a lot more of that, David.
But this underscores the trend, again, that it used to be that we really focused primarily on what people did during their work time. Now, with respect to the extent it impacts health, where they go when they're not at work, what activities they engage in, who is well or not well within their household, all becomes acutely relevant. And employers are recognizing, and the guidance suggests, that that's fair game. So, and you'd be well advised to do that. Bert, and then we're going to jump to the next slide.
Well, the interesting thing about this is that, 3-4 months ago, you had states, legally or not, issuing quarantines and barriers about people traveling. Right. Now, look again, it's gone to the individual employers to be the policeman, as it were, for responding to COVID. And not every employer has the capability or the interest in imposing these kinds of restrictions on their employees. It's a problem.
All right, well, let's talk briefly about some of the mask issues. Next slide.
The mask wars.
Mask wars continue.
Well,
I see the gentleman in the picture, by the way, wearing open carry, debating whether he will or won't be required to put a mask on in that store. But go ahead.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a kind of a broken record. The lack of a national policy with respect to something that's for some reason in the middle of a health crisis has become a political issue, and you want to say, really? How did that happen, and why did that happen? But the issue here is that many stores, and there's a long list, including some of the largest retail employers and retail markets in the United States, including Walmart, including Target, have now issued their own mask-required mandates for their stores. Right. But in terms of enforcement, that means that greeter at Walmart, that retiree probably in a wheelchair or a cart, is going to have to be the one confronting folks such as we see in the bottom here. Many stores will ask people but will not enforce people to wear a mask and let them in. Others are taking stronger, will offer people masks. The issue is, are these employers going to be offering training Are they going to be offering some form of protection? Because believe it or not, we've had serious violence. In one case, there have been there was a shooting. In another case, there have been beatings of these poor folks just saying, "Please wear a mask." Many stores are saying, "We ask people to wear a mask. If they don't, we won't serve them, but we won't confront them." Others are taking different modes of view.
Right.
Remember, the OSHA guidance and the president is urging people to wear the mask. Most people in America believe it's a great idea, but the issue.
It's not just retail. It's airplanes. It's a lot of.
Oh golly, yeah.
Data quickly, and then we're going to go to the Hill.
Oh, I was just going to say, and then the ultimate was this weekend. If you didn't see it, there were two people wearing Nazi masks. They were wearing masks, but they had Nazi on them, and they have been barred from Walmart for a year.
And the backdrop to all this, folks, goes back to one of our first slides: 4 million cases and rising.
Right.
Yep.
All right. Well, let's.
So, David, what's
see,
Congress doing?
Next slide. Yeah. Let's.
Here we go.
As we have said several times, if you're waiting for the government to provide the solution, that's not working too well.
Right.
And the most recent chapter in that is it's primarily with the Senate. The Senate went home this weekend. They didn't stay in session. The Republicans have announced they will announce their bill today. It's still dribs and drabs, but the outlines, at least, because frankly there is disagreement within the Republican coalition, whereas they may be pretty good at voting in a block for judicial nominees and certain tax cut issues. The COVID crisis is proving to be vexing. There's not a consensus on what to do with unemployment. There's not a consensus as to how to fund the states. There's not a consensus between even the Republicans on the Hill and the White House on how to deal with these issues. Here's what we know at this point, that many of the White House initiatives, which would be payroll tax cut, no money to states at all for any purposes for either police or testing or contact tracing, those issues have been largely pushed to the side. That the Republicans on the Hill have basically said, we're largely running for re-election. That's not going to work. We've been home. That we need something different. That being said, the response, the look at what the House passed a little over 2 months ago, which is the so-called HEROES Act, that's a $3 trillion package. Many Republicans, there is consensus on that. That feels a little rich, but they can't quite agree on what to cut back. Most important is unemployment benefit. We all know there's been the $600 supplement that is scheduled to end July 31. As a practical matter, because of the timing, people are winding off of that benefit this week. There's an open issue as to whether some lower amount, which is what there is a growing Republican consensus. The criticism of 600 is that it allows people to make more not working than working. That has a common sense appeal. That shouldn't occur. The challenge is getting it calibrated and to make those changes now in real time so that people don't suffer a gap. Keep in mind that doing things retroactively for people that are living on the edge, paycheck to check, doesn't do much good if you figure this out 4 to 6 weeks from now. Other issues that are keeping the parties very far apart. Are they going to provide monies? Is the federal government going to provide monies to the school districts to promote reopening? Right. All the additional cleaning, distancing, et cetera, very expensive. Testing, that contact tracing, hospitals, all of that funding levels. That is a huge disconnect between them. I would say at this point, Senator McConnell has said over the weekend that it will take weeks to get this resolved. The unemployment is driving that. The feds have at least extended the points that people cannot be evicted if you have a Fannie or Freddie mortgage. So you're at least protected from eviction on that basis if it's a COVID-related problem. But the resolution of this still remains quite murky, and whether there's going to be a short-term rifle shot to take care of unemployment while the rest gets worked out, whether we're going to allow unemployment to fall over the cliff, We don't know at this point. I think it's fair to say we just don't know. The other pressure is both parties, Congress is supposed to go out the first week of August. They're going to move into the political conventions, and then it's full-blown, not that it's not already, full-blown election from that point forward. So these issues are murky, I would say, as we speak to you today. Nita or Bert, any
David,
comment on this? Nita, then Bert.
The only thing please, Nita, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bert. So
well,
the point
only
I was
issue
was,
I would mention.
Nita,
I was going to make the
Bert.
point that the broad liability protections, David, you didn't mention those, but I believe, and
Right.
this is probably where Bert was going to go, that Speaker Pelosi said there will be no broad liability protections for employers of essential workers, which may be her opening for McConnell to come back with something. And then Bert?
Well, my issue is mainly the timing. Even if there were a bill, and even if it were able to get passed through both houses and get signed, especially with respect to getting money out into people's hands, there is an
Right.
inbuilt delay. So that in the best of circumstances, we're talking about people who may be literally paycheck to paycheck, having to fill some gap somewhere, and there doesn't seem to be the urgency that we would hope to find in our elected representatives.
Yeah. And let me just circle back while we'll move off this, Nita, to you pick up next in a moment here. But on this essential workers, Pelosi's point is those were people based on the federal government's order that were
Right.
required to work. And even if the workplace was supposed to meet OSHA guidance, but we
Right.
know that the meatpacking plants are really what we're talking about here. It appears that in not all instances did that occur, or was it feasible to occur? And the question is, do those employers enjoy a safe harbor? And that's the question that Leader Pelosi is certainly calling to the fore. All right, Bert, quickly, and then I want to move on to the next. Yeah.
Yeah, just one final point on the way, poetic justice or irony. The Republicans are having a very difficult time in light of the fact that they have now canceled their convention because of COVID concerns.
Right.
At the same moment, telling schools and businesses that it's safe to reopen, but it's not so safe that you don't need a liability protection. So it's kind of like it's this house of cards that's falling apart.
Well, the disconnect in the messaging reflects that there's very fundamental disagreements within the Republican bloc. And this is the first time we have seen that fracture so exposed to the public during the Trump administration. It has really shown something that we haven't seen up to this point. All right.
Right.
Well, as I say, we'll see. We'll have the answers to this. But Nita, let's talk. One of the other real challenges that employers face is the continued social challenges on equality and fueled by Black Lives Matter.
So, Valerie, can we have the next slide? I think the most important thing to come out of this, and I'm going to mention something that's not on the slide as well. First of all, I think for the first time that I can remember, and I defer to you, I think we've all seen this over the years that we've been working with corporations. Corporations often come out and say they support this or they support that, and they very strong, statements of support with the Black Lives Matter when the protests began. But now they're being pushed by various, as we talked about a little bit last time, there are, in addition to the Comptroller of New York, which we mentioned last time, there are several other groups that are pushing this as well. Calvert Research and Management, Just Capital, NIA Capital. So there is a group of shareholder activists who are pushing to say, all right, publish your EEO1 or some other, that's what they prefer because they can then compare across the organizations. But they want employers, if you really are serious about supporting Black Lives Matter, let's see what your numbers are like and what are you going to do to improve the number of African Americans in your organization and how they move up. Another, I thought, very interesting article for those who have a few minutes that was published last week showed the New York Times did a very extensive, in-depth review of those corporations, who put out statements, but where they actually put their money. What organizations do they give to? And there were a number. Walmart was one, and there were a couple of others specifically mentioned who have been very anti-Black, very anti-LGBT, for example. So I think that there is a push to say, to actually look behind what corporations are saying. And one last thing I wanted to mention before we move on, and this is going to be an ongoing problem. I think corporations need to understand they are not going to be able to skate by with just a statement. They're going to be asked and pushed to say, what are you doing now? What are you going to do? How are you going to improve? But one really tragic thing that came up is there was an article that mentioned a number of corporations have had open forums around race. The ones that specifically were mentioned in the article that I looked at, they were mentioning they had this open forum, and they had anonymous ways for employees to respond to what the company was planning on doing. There were a number of employees who said very horrible things about African Americans in those chat boxes, and where they put their name to it, they have been fired by corporations. But the reaction is, I think, senior management is have been very upset with having a percentage of their employees who believes basically that Black Lives Matter is not something that should be supported, and in fact are virulently racist. And how are they going to deal with that moving forward? And that was, I think, very surprising to many corporations. And David, do you all have anything else?
Well, yeah, my experience has been that, generally speaking, among the clients we've been dealing with at the most senior levels, they are all in. And when it comes to disclosure, talk about our diversity and inclusion, talk about our metrics, talk about our goals, very, very forthcoming. And these situations where individual employees, I mean, you hear on the chat boards, they're thought patrol and this sort of thing, but the companies are really saying, no, there's not thought patrol, but that sort of hate speech, that sort of conduct is not going to be tolerated, period.
Right.
That's not part of our values. And I think that trend is empowering to the human resource function and the compliance function that most of you on this call are involved with. So should be a high watermark and great challenges, but very, very important developments. All right.
I will say one last thing, and one last thing before we go on, and this is a perfect segue on that, is that HR all of a sudden has become recognized as important to organizations. Yay, HR!
Exactly. Well, we said before we're not going to rely on the government to do everything, but the agencies continue apace. So, Bert, do you want to lead off? Let's roll through. We've got about 15 minutes to cover what the agencies are.
Okay. This is a really important decision. The General Motors decision has been years in coming. Basically, this brings Title VII into the National Labor Relations Act. For years, under the guise of concerted protected speech, racist and sexist commentary has been forgiven if it was in the context of the mill and the mine, heated outbursts, so long as it was related to some kind of group, some kind of concerted activity. It's been criticized for years because it put employers in the impossible situation of facing a harassment claim on the one hand under Title VII, or if they disciplined a worker being charged with an unfair labor practice. The General Motors decision ends that dilemma after years and years of effort. Racist and sexist and profane speech can be criticized. The Wright Line decision is if the conduct is discipline worthy, just because it's related to the union doesn't forgive it. The EEOC has been pushing for this for years and years, and it's finally happened, and it's a long time coming, and we're glad to see it happen. One thing else with the NLRB, and I'll speak quickly about it, there are nominees for the board, and we anticipate they've cleared, the cloture vote has come. We anticipate if Congress has a moment to spare from all its other more pressing concerns, that the NLRB nominees will be confirmed this week. But the big news from the NLRB is that Title VII and the NLRA are more or less now in the same pew.
It's very helpful.
Let's move on.
Very helpful to employers, yes.
Yes, indeed. Very.
Nita, do you want to lead this, please?
Okay, next slide. I just wanted to give a couple, the Department of Labor Wage and Hour, which has been incredibly busy, issued on last week some updates, some guidance. And David, for most of the FLSA guidance was pretty straightforward, but there were a couple that were pretty interesting. One was a reminder that even if someone is teleworking who's a non-exempt employee, even if that telework is not authorized, you've got to pay. There was a lot of discussion for non-exempt employees, allowing them to break their day up so they can take care of their kids in the middle, for example, and that would still be allowable that would not be a violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And you can allow exempt employees to do non-exempt work during this period of time. On the FMLA side, they basically said that you can't use FMLA to stay home if you're afraid you're going to get COVID. FMLA doesn't cover that. You either have to be sick or a family member has to be sick. So if you're concerned about exposure, you're going to have to come up with a different way to deal with it. You can't, you've got employees out on FMLA, you can't decide to lay them off first because they do have a protection unless you have another reason the job's been eliminated or other reasons under FMLA. Telemedicine, this is a big decision. Telemedicine counts as going to a doctor, which is required under FMLA, and so the telemedicine will replace, it's the same as an in-person visit till the end of the year, so till December 31, 2020. And you can't avoid, if the employer's testing everybody when they come back, just because you were out on FMLA for a non-COVID event, you can still be forced to be tested for COVID. Why you wouldn't want to be is a whole other question, but right. That apparently has come up. And David, were there a couple of FFCRA questions that we wanted to
Yeah, there were a couple of further guidances. There are actually 4 new questions, numbers 94 through 97. If you look at the website, helpfully, and thank you, Wage Hour, you have actually added dates so we can see when you've updated the questions.
Yay!
Now, which is very helpful to those of us that are used to put them in the middle and you couldn't find them. But the questions really deal with how to deal. It's the current dynamic. People have been furloughed, they're coming back. Right. May you require a person to telework or take leave until he's been tested? The answer is yes. You can put him on that type of point. The question about how furlough plays, if you recall, there are 12 weeks of leave. You've taken 4 weeks in the example in the question, went on furlough and then come back. You still have 8 weeks left. The furlough doesn't burn the time that's required. And also, you cannot distinguish either favorably or unfavorably to a person as to whether they may want to take protected leave. Again, that's something that I think was well understood in advance, but has been reinforced. These questions continue to be very important sources for compliance, and I would encourage everyone to be sure that they, in fact, are looking at them carefully as they chart through, because the Labor Department has brought a number, they're settlements. They haven't had to litigate. They're not big settlements, but they continue to find a lot of employers don't understand when they're to put people on paid leave, how they're to handle this. Right. And the Labor Department, Wage Hour, is robustly investigating and holding employers accountable. So please take the time, make sure you understand this, get it right, because the DOL is very involved in this and is very committed to making sure these are enforced. So, we often criticize parts of the government, but in this case, the Wage and Hour has been active and important, and they ought to be congratulated. I agree.
And one last thing, David, before one last, the only thing I was going to say is that with the problems we're going to have around schools not opening or opening partially or being, I think that employers need to be especially careful as to what, because they can use that child care emergency FMLA and the paid leave for that.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot more activity on that, and Congress may further revisit these topics depending on how these negotiations go. Is 12 weeks enough? Because many people have exhausted their 12-week bank. So we'll see. All right, Bert, let's talk about EEOC.
Happily, let me just reverse the order and have everybody remember that this is the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's proof that government can and will act to improve the lives of millions of people. Having been present at the creation at the Labor Department, I'm especially pleased to make that announcement. So, Nita talked about corporate responsibility, and the flip side of that is the government responding to the same kinds of pressures on pay equity. There was a controversial and perhaps botched attempt to get employers to give the EEOC compensation data called Component 2. The EEOC almost certainly responding to the pressures that that businesses are feeling, has announced that they will initiate a study by the National Academy of Science again to see if there is a better way, a more effective way, a better methodology to collect pay equity data. But this is a clear example of the government responding to the same sorts of pressures that big businesses responding to try to deal with the issue of pay equity, the issue of pay transparency. And this is a promising announcement because we needed a better way than we had in the past. The other thing, we mentioned earlier that the NLRB board members are likely to be confirmed this week. We thought the same was true for the EEOC, but they have been split off. There's no longer a package. And as a result, they are still pending. There are rumors of a hold. So we cannot say when or if these commissioners will be confirmed this week or this session before the recess.
Great. Nita.
Running out of time.
I was just going to mention that there's really two parts to this study that OFCCP is asking. One part is to evaluate Component 2 data to see whether it's worth anything, for one thing. And then the second part is, as you mentioned, Bert, to see whether there is a better way. If this isn't the way, what is a better way? And revisit the 2012 report that was issued by the National Academy as well.
Right. Nita's been a little modest. She was part of the effort on the 2012 report and directly involved the advisory group on that, so she knows about what she speaks. Let me just say, though, this has a practical go-forward point on the study of pay collection. If you think there's going to be a Biden administration change, a Biden administration, they'll be much more inclined to reinstitute the pay data collection. And so the question of whether and what and how, it's really important that that be sorted out soundly and not just a rush. I think the last one was pretty much a rush to judgment, and I think we could do better than that. All right. Well, let's talk briefly about OFC. Still got a few minutes for that, and Nita, maybe you can kick that off.
Sure, and I just want to mention briefly, we talked quite a bit about OFCCP in our last session because OFCCP Director Lean had just spoken to the virtual NILG, mentioned that the letters, expect scheduling letters, and by the way, we are seeing our clients are getting scheduling letters. If you're on the CSAL list from March of 2019 and you have not yet gotten your scheduling letter, expect that you're going to get one pretty soon. Also, the VEVRA letters are coming out, but also OFCCP, I think, in anticipation perhaps that Director Lean would be moving on, has had over $2 million that they've announced in settlements. These were mostly, there were a couple of 2 for pay discrimination and 4 for hiring discrimination. So we are starting to see them collect more money around pay discrimination than we have in the past. Anything else, David, that you think we need to pass on before we move on to the takeaways?
No, I just want to highlight this focused review. That's a relatively new concept, and which means it's not a full-blown, if you will, audit compliance evaluation, to use the agency's nomenclature, but it's designed to hone in on specific practices. The individuals with disabilities has been a pretty long-standing focus, certainly by Director Lean over the last 2 years, but now addressing promotion. And that is where I think most thoughtful people are concerned. If there are glass ceiling issues, that organizations, and we say this from our experience, hiring typically is not the issue. It's what happens after people get hired.
Right.
Do they progress? Do they get, as the OFC would say, channeled? Do they get promoted in equal manner? Those are issues that I think are worthy to look at and consider. I would suggest that many in the OFCCP don't have a lot of experience. So I think that we as contractors are going to see a lot of challenges explaining, because they're much more nuanced and often factually and legally difficult, the promotion questions. So I think that's going to end up being a very challenging set of focused reviews for many organizations. All right.
And I wanted to make one last thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Nita, then
just to note that, Nita, please.
Okay.
Okay. I was just going to mention the accommodation focused reviews, David and Bert, are not just going to be on reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities, but when Tina Williams, the policy director, spoke last week, she said it's also going to be religious accommodation, so buckle up for that.
Yeah, and one of the issues that our listeners should be aware of is most of you really don't have very good data on these issues. Many people don't make a distinction between an accommodation and an adjustment, just being a good guy. You're now going to have to parcel it out to be able to show the kind of stuff that you have done,
correct,
rather than simply being a good employer.
Okay, let's look quickly at our takeaways. We have a minute or two. Next slide. And so what do we have? I'll kick it off. The workforce dilemma, school openings, a lot more than students. It really is going to impact who works, how they work, when they work, where they work, and a host of issues. And employers, I predict, you're going to need to underwrite a lot of the solution here. The government just isn't going to get it done effectively soon enough to help your workplace operate effectively.
And that segues into the second point, that the Congress is not yet in a shape to be able to create meaningful responses to our dilemma, and it will be some days, I hope, if not some weeks, before we get a consensus for congressional relief to the COVID-19 crisis.
And I think the accountability aspect is something that employers need to expect, that they're not just going to be able, and I think many employers are trying to they understand this is different, that they are going to be held accountable, and they have to do more than, they've got to walk the walk. They can't just talk the talk.
And let me just say, I think a best practice at this point, any major employer should assume it's going to get the ask, whether it's from a shareholder, whether it's from their employee, whether it's from a reporter. And to avoid the naming shaming concept, you need to have an answer. Here's what our diversity efforts look like. Here's what we're doing. Here's what our current workforce is, et cetera. And I think that at this point, an effort should be made in the next 30 days for every major company to at least have that as a minimum on the shelf, ready to go. All right. Finally, the agencies continue to be beyond COVID and are active. And I particularly appreciate the NLRB and EEOC being on the same page, because candidly, I tended to advise clients to violate the National Labor Relations Act if necessary in order to do a more thorough Title VII harassment. But that always felt uncomfortable, and I didn't think we should have that conflict. Right. All right. Well, I think that we are right on the time, so I want to thank everyone. Our next briefing is going to be on the 24th, and Nita and Bert, thank you. And Valerie, why don't you take us out?
It's our pleasure.
We would like to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, all registrants from today have been registered for future briefings, and you may view this briefing as well as our previous COVID-19 weekly briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. The next briefing will be August 24th. Be on the lookout for additional updates which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through the survey. Thank you in advance for completing this survey, and of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com.
Great. Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you.